Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating challenge in cybersecurity. How do you measure network cyber threats when you just don't have all the puzzle pieces? We're drawing our insights from a pretty compelling research methodology by Artem Zhilin and Hannah Holich. They essentially completely rethought how organizations can assess their threat landscape when, traditional textbook data is simply out of reach.
So think about it. We live in a world of constant, rapidly evolving cyber threats. Now, best practices tell us we need to conduct full-fledged, comprehensive risk assessments, right? But here's the reality check. Conducting a perfect risk assessment is almost always impossible. Most organizations just lack complete contextual data. They might not know every single vulnerability hiding in their legacy systems, or they might be completely blind to certain predisposing conditions. So what do? Do you just guess? Or do you find a new way to measure the danger using only the limited data you actually have?
Well, here's our roadmap to figure that out. First, we'll hit the cyber data problem, then threat versus risk, mapping the cyber domain, the four-step process, classifying those cyber threats, and finally, making better security decisions. Let's dive in.
Okay, Section 1, the cyber data problem, or really the issue of missing context.
The absolute crucial point here is that organizations rarely have enough data to perform a complete cyber risk assessment. In the real world, IT environments are messy, to put it lightly. You've got legacy systems, shadow IT, constant updates. To calculate true cyber risk, you need to know your exact vulnerabilities and the likelihood of those being exploited. But when you're operating under what the researchers call conditions of limited data, traditional risk assessment methods fall incredibly short. Because if you don't know your vulnerabilities, you literally can't calculate risk. It's kind of like trying to figure out the structural integrity of a building without knowing what materials were used for the foundation. You're just guessing.
Which brings us to Section 2, threat versus risk, a really crucial distinction. It sounds like a simple question, doesn't it? We toss these terms around interchangeably all the time in this industry, but in the context of this methodology, it's vital. Think of it like this. It's the difference between a burglar aggressively rattling your front door handle versus you actually having a broken lock on that door. The burglar trying the handle, that's the threat. The broken lock and the likelihood that they'll get inside and steal your servers, well, that is the risk.
So, cyber risk requires a comprehensive view. It demands that full vulnerability context. A cyber threat assessment, on the other hand, is a highly focused analysis. It relies purely on the specific observable actions and actors that are actively targeting your organization right now. If we don't have the data to measure the full risk, we have to isolate and measure the threat.
Just think about the classic cyber risk sequence. A cyber threat source kicks off a cyber threat event. That event causes an adverse impact, which ultimately produces your organizational cyber risk. Now, since we lack the metrics for our internal vulnerabilities, the actual things that turn a threat into a costly impact, it's way more realistic to just focus our attention strictly on the start of that sequence. We need to start by measuring the cyber threat events flowing through our network traffic, because honestly, that's the data we actually have on hand.
Moving right along to Section 3, mapping the cyber domain and seeing where these threats actually happen. You can think of the battlefield as clearly divided. On the outside, you've got the cyber threat surface, the vast Wild West of the internet filled with diverse adversaries. And on the inside, you have your defense surface. That's your organization's network security domain. Right at the boundary between those two is your attack surface. As threats try to cross that boundary, they generate network traffic. So by placing specialized network traffic monitoring tools right there on the inside edge, we can continuously capture the data generated by those threat events, even if we don't know exactly what internal assets they might ultimately compromise.
All right, Section 4, the four-step process for executing this assessment.
The whole methodology breaks down into 4 sequential stages. First up is preparation, where you define your scope and identify your data sources. Second is conducting, where the actual classification and mathematical scoring happens. Third is interpreting, where you translate that score into something you can use for executive briefings. And finally, maintaining, where you continuously run the assessment over time to track your trends.
Building this into a structured process makes it repeatable. And the real magic happens in that conducting phase. That is where you take your approach for classifying threats, identify their specific characteristics, and calculate a definitive cyber threat score. But obviously, to do that accurately, you have to know exactly what you're looking at in the raw data.
Which leads perfectly into Section 5, classifying cyber threats.
You see, you have to systematically extract specific attributes from those network packets. When an event triggers an alert, you grab the source IP address, the destination port, and very importantly, the vendor signatures. The vendor signature is what the detection rule actually flags it as. By organizing this packet data into these strict attributes, you take raw, chaotic network noise and give it vital context. You isolate exactly who is knocking on the door and what specific tool they're trying to use to break in.
And once you have those attributes, you categorize the events using a predefined taxonomy. You aren't just logging generic bad traffic. You're identifying if the threat behaves like a stealer aiming to grab credentials, spyware looking to quietly monitor activity, a remote access Trojan trying to establish backdoor control, or maybe just a standard Trojan masking its true intent. Creating this taxonomy lets you apply different weights and severities to different types of traffic. Because, let's be real, a rat is a very different level of threat compared to generic adware, and your quantitative score absolutely has to reflect that reality.
Finally, Section 6, making better security decisions. The whole reason we're doing this.
The greatest benefit of this entire exercise is the output itself. By translating raw, limited network data into a unified, quantified score, you finally get a reliable metric that reflects your active threat landscape. You are no longer flying blind just because you couldn't complete a perfect vulnerability scan across your entire enterprise. You have a hard number that says, hey, this is the exact volume and severity of attacks hitting our outer walls right now.
I really love this quote from the researchers because it hits the nail on the head regarding why this matters. This objective score literally gives grounds for supporting managerial decisions. It allows you to compare threat levels across different time periods. You can look at Q1 versus Q2 and confidently say, our threat score doubled. That perfectly supports executive decisions. It gives you the concrete evidence you need to justify budget increases, shift your defense strategies around, or invest in new tools. It translates highly technical packet data into a language the boardroom actually understands. So I'm going to leave you with this provocative thought to consider for your own networks. In cybersecurity, we often let perfect be the enemy of the good. Waiting for total visibility usually just means operating in the dark today. Taking this first step to systematically quantify your threats, using the network data you already have flowing right now, might just be the most critical managerial decision you make all year. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep looking closely at what your network traffic is trying to tell you.